Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ask, the Holyoke Media Series where we talk with city officials and members of boards and commissions about the work they do in the city and what the public should know. Today we're back with Alicia Zoeller from the Office for Community Development, and we're also joined by our Mayor, Joshua Garcia. So thank you both for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
We have a special episode today because we will be focusing on the Community Development Block Grants, the CDBG program that provides a lot of federal money to the city of Holyoke. So I am going to turn it over to Joshua and to Alicia, and let's find out what we really need to know about CDBG.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having us. Mayor?
Yeah. Well, Alicia and I, work as a team here. Obviously, there's a long history behind CDBG across the United States, and also as it relates to the history of our own city. And there's it's National Community Development Week?
National Community Development Week from April 1st to April 5th.
And we certainly want to take this moment to celebrate a number of things. I would say, obviously, we want to celebrate all the good CDBG has done. There's certainly an opportunity here to learn from a lot of lessons learned and how we can take that and pivot where we need to be sure that as we move forward and continue to invest these federal dollars in our community to address all sorts of social determinants of health issues, that we're doing it in a way that's effective and achieving the outcomes that we're looking to achieve.
Now, Alicia, we talked about this briefly in our previous interview. What exactly is this program? So for people who may have heard the letters but may really know nothing about CDBG, can you break it down for us?
Sure, absolutely. So at first I want to say government loves acronyms and they love abbreviations, right?
That's right.
Everything, we speak our own language.
That's right.
So it's really exciting for the week of April 1st to April 5th this year, 2024, because it's the 50th anniversary of the Community Development Block Grant Program. The program was enacted in 1974 by President Gerald Ford, and it was funneled with funds through the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, which is still in existence today. The Community Development Block Grant Program provides direct grants to over 1,100 communities across the country. So we work directly with our partners at HUD in Boston to receive those funds and utilize those funds here in the city.
And you'll be talking about how those funds can be used, the different categories that they can be used for.
Yep, so one of the important things with the program is that it is federally funded, and we know the political climate that we're living in. And it's important to note that this is one of the few federal programs that receives extensive bipartisan support. So while we receive funding here in Holyoke, there are a number of rural communities across the country, in the South, the Midwest, who also receive Community Development Block Grant funds. And because it's so diverse, makes it a very popular program on the federal level.
And it's also important to note, and in case folks don't, there's non-entitlement communities and there's entitlement communities. And so the city of Holyoke, and Alicia can probably simplify and explain a little better, but the city of Holyoke is what is categorized as an entitlement community, so we get it automatically every year. And those non-entitlement communities that are eligible to receive CDBG funds have to go forward and apply for it. So those are two very distinct differences that oftentimes people are not fully aware of.
What's the eligibility based on?
So the eligibility is based on a formula allocation that is done by the federal government on a pretty regular basis. And they look at our population, they look at our census data, things like household income, age of housing stock, needs of the community, and they do a formula allocation. And then Congress appropriates a sum of money, and then depending on the formula, depends on how much we get every year.
So we have been an entitlement community since the beginning of this program?
We have. So the thing that's so unique, and I think why mayors really like the CDBG program, is that it provides a maximum level of flexibility for use in the community.
Okay.
There's a number of requirements to it, a number of federal requirements.
But it wouldn't be a federal program
right,
without a lot of requirements,
without a lot of
would it?
strings. But we're looking in 3 areas for the program: to ensure decent housing, to create and maintain suitable living environments, and to expand economic opportunities. But for mayors, that allows them to meet the needs of their communities in a creative and flexible approach.
Right. there are all sorts of quality of life objectives, mayors, particularly in communities like Holyoke, that we're trying to plan for and address. And so obviously with resources continuously being limited, that flexibility that Alicia is alluding to is critical for cities like Holyoke so that we can achieve our goals.
So the CDBG program is primarily geared to low and moderate income residents and low and moderate income neighborhoods. And I know that we spoke in our last interview about what does that really mean to be low and moderate income.
Yes.
And so when we think about the income limits, a very high percentage of the residents in Holyoke actually qualify. And so for a household of one in this year's current income limits, a household of one making $55,800 or less would qualify for the programs that we offer. But the other key piece of this is that the mayors in Holyoke have traditionally made investments that benefit the entire community.
That's right. Yeah, and I could tell you, born and raised in City Holyoke, I grew up in South Holyoke, which is probably the poorest, or I guess the proper way would be economically disadvantaged neighborhood in the city. And just growing up, I benefited in so many different ways that we can get into. Like I've benefited from CDBG investments, whether if it's support to a nonprofit organization that's offering services, or investment in infrastructure, making sure that the parks and streets or sidewalks are in good working condition and so forth. So,
let me ask you a little bit more, Alicia, about these income limits. When we talk about that, we're talking about your gross income. What all goes into determining a person's or family's income?
So the income limits are based on what's called the Metropolitan Statistical Area. So the federal government looks at incomes around surrounding communities. The country is broken up into what's called these MSAs, these small grouped areas. And they look at the median income in those areas and then determine at 80% of that median income, where does that income fall? So the MSA median income for our area, not just for Holyoke, but for the entire statistical area, is actually $93,700 household income, which sounds quite high. But the statistical area and the pool that they're including in those calculations include our bedroom communities, like Agawam in East Longmeadow and Longmeadow. So communities that have very high household median incomes. And so when they look at the household median income for the area, we then determine that for this program, if you're at 80% of that, you would qualify.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else about the income levels that you think people should know?
I think that, there's sometimes, in terms of like the creativity of the program, we really want to be adaptable to the needs of the community. So there are times where a household might approach us and not be low or moderate income household, but there are circumstances whereby their house might be condemned and they would have no place to live, or there's extraneous circumstances, illness, job loss, or you might have had a very high income last year, but this year due to illness you do not. So we try to be as flexible and as creative in getting folks the assistance they need. One of the mottos in our office is that we like to screen people into the program and not out of the program.
Well, that's a good motto to have.
Yeah.
So did you want to talk about some of the different areas that CDBG can fund?
Sure. I think first it would be helpful for folks to know that over the last 50 years or so, Holyoke has received between $1 million and $2 million annually. And of that, there are three distinct areas that we're allowed to put our funds. So the first one is 15% of our annual allocation. So right off the top, HUD will notify us how much we're getting for a grant. 15% of that can be allocated to public services. So those are activities like our food pantries, daycare, after-school programming, domestic violence, those services that people need for quality of life. Okay. 20% is 20% off the top is allocated to administrative and planning. Obviously, with federal funds, there's lots of strings attached. We like to tell folks that for every penny that we spend, there's about 35 areas of law that we must comply with. So if someone gets a $500 grant, we need to make sure that we check boxes all the way down the line. And then the third area, so that's 15% and 20%. And then the remainder is the funding that we use for things like housing, parks, infrastructure, economic development, sidewalks, that sort of thing.
And I know when we talked last, you were talking about the priority that this administration has given to housing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've heard housing is a statewide problem, and when the team takes a deep dive in what's happening in Holyoke at all levels of housing, and then you couple that with the challenges that are happening statewide, one way or another, there's a direct impact to the city. And so, whether if it's low threshold housing for unhoused folks, if it's workforce housing, market rate housing, basic sheltering, there's a wide range of different housing impacts. And the city of Holyoke, for as long as I've lived here, it's a compassionate city. It's a community that's always done what it could within what they have to take care of the most vulnerable populations. I like to say that a lot of times we're more progressive than so-called progressive communities. When communities say, no, we don't want that in our backyard, Holyoke's always found some sort of creative way to try to meet the need. But the need is great. In a lot of ways, sometimes it feels like, we barely scratched the surface. But when you take a step back and you look at what Holyoke has been able to do, and Alicia and I were actually talking about this earlier, when you look at what we've been able to do, how much we've been able to achieve, the assets and resources we have available for people across the spectrum, there's a lot that we can be proud about and celebrate. But one of the priorities that we had, I remember our first winter, I was getting tagged on all these posts about warming shelters.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, why don't we have a warming shelter? And it sounds so simple. And so we get the team together and realize how simple it isn't. And either way, because, again, it's important that if it's important to the administration, we figure it out. And so we've made it a priority and got creative with our partnerships and was able to do, at minimum, warming shelters during extreme weather events so that at minimum people aren't dying in our alleyways, right? And so Alicia and her team was able to come up with a pretty good plan and to make sure that we can at least do that. And then also everything else, we have all sorts of housing objectives, again, from the recent low threshold housing, 46 units or so, that, through a partnership with a local nonprofit, to other avenues that we're spearheading with advocating for more market rate level housing, that OPED has been working with private, property owners, which is another interesting thing, because when you think about, you hear this thing where people say, hey, the neighborhoods aren't improving. And we quickly learn it's not that neighborhoods aren't improving. People's lives in neighborhoods are improving. And when they do, when they've achieved a certain economic standard, they move out. Right. They go to Chicopee, actually. I've bumped into a lot of people that moved to Chicopee. And so the median household income downtown, when you look at the 4 census tracts that make downtown Holyoke, is less than $19,000 a year.
That's incredible, isn't it?
There's an unintended consequence here. We've done so much to take care of our most vulnerable, where we really didn't realize what would happen when folks' lives improve and what would happen after that. And so there is definitely a need for more market rate housing. And I think the Cubit is a good example for those folks that say, you can do market rate, but no one wants to live downtown of that standard. Well, that's not true. The Cubit has this long waiting list, and we're not talking about taking dedicated low-income housing offline and get it ready for market rate. We mean activating spaces that are not being used for anything, like the Cubit, right? It was an old factory, like the Alpaca Mill, and other buildings. How do we get creative with activating those spaces and offering more housing without taking our low income? So we're creating kind of like this mixed income situation that'll then increase the vibrancy more in our downtown. But we've done so much compassion work where now we have a level of quality of life challenges that we're constantly trying to get ahead of. But I think the root cause of this really is, how do we establish a situation where it's mixed one more example, and I want Alicia to jump in. A few months ago, as I was driving down Main Street with my twins, my son tells me, "Dad, what is that building right there?" It was the cubic. He was pointing at the cubic. And I told him what it was. He's 11 years old. And he's like, "Does people live in it?" And I say, "Yes, buddy, people live in it." He's like, "I want to live in that building." Well, that's what I want. Like when circumstances improve in a household, that people are going to look at the housing stock downtown and say, "I don't want to leave my city. I want to stay in my city. What's suitable for me and my new economic standard?" And
that those options are available.
Right.
And they're limited and barely not.
Well, and as someone who purposely moved downtown, because it was affordable for me and because I really wanted to be in the downtown area of the city, I'm excited by the prospect of doing things to revitalize our downtown neighborhoods so that people who have lived there a long time can continue to live there and not be pushed out by gentrification.
Right.
But that we can also have some increased housing.
I got to say that Holyoke, and we're documenting this, so mark my words now. I think that Holyoke is in a very unique position to be some sort of a case study or best practice that municipalities across the United States can study. Because obviously gentrification, in grad school, in undergrad and grad school, we talk a lot about gentrification in communities and how do we improve conditions and try to avoid situations where people are getting pushed out of their neighborhoods. And the interesting thing about Holyoke is that, what we do very well, and I would say better than a lot of communities, and we compete with our second largest, third largest metropolitan city in the Commonwealth, our small city of 38,000, competing with Springfield. Holyoke and Springfield do a lot of this same work hand in hand. We've done so much around low income, affordable, and there's still more work to be done. I don't want to take away the fact that there's still some challenges. I think there's a unique opportunity here to say, okay, here's what we have for dedicated affordable housing stock, low income housing. How do we introduce now opportunity for market rate without eliminating that existing housing stock? And we're going to do more. We're going to do more affordable housing, low income housing where we can while we continue to advocate. I think the best example in a micro level is the Churchill neighborhood. So when you look at the Churchill neighborhood 20 plus years ago, you had an area that was, it was blighted to some degree, and there was a lot of quality of life challenges there. And home ownership opportunity for income qualified folks was introduced. Now you got families that live in low income housing and home ownership that are in a neighborhood, sharing parks, probably going to each other's birthday parties or whatever the case. 20 plus years later, you go in the neighborhood and it's still well maintained.
It looks great.
It's
looks
still,
great.
you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
you got families there that are looking at the houses across the street from their apartment saying, "Hey, I want to buy a house like that." Linda, how did you do it? How did you buy this house? Can you show me? Yeah, let me show you how to do it. That's like the micro model that I think we can do on a grander scale, and I think we're trying to replicate that currently with the South Holyoke Homes project.
We are. So South Holyoke Homes is a project that the Holyoke Housing Authority is working on, and they received not CDBG funds, but some of our COVID funds, and they're in the process of developing 20 homeownership opportunities. So one of the issues with doing homeownership and downtown revitalization is a scale. You don't want to be the only homeowner in the only house on a very large vacant block. And so by scaling it up to 20 units, you are basically creating a small neighborhood. So all the units will be built pretty much at the same time. They'll be occupied by the same time. And so this will be sort of an instant neighborhood. And that's the type of thing, block by block, street by street, is the process that we've been taking. I think one of the things that's important to note when we talk about affordable housing or market rate housing is here in the city of Holyoke, when you look at the federal government, when you look at HUD's rents and fair market rent, the fair market rent is the affordable rent here in Holyoke. So for instance, for a one bedroom, it's currently our income cap or our rent cap is $987, and when you look at the fair market rent, it is also at $987. So the idea of developing market rate units simply means that there are no income restrictions attached to that. So anyone could move into that unit, whether I'm making $100,000 a year or I'm making $25,000 a year. I think that's important to remember. The other piece with market rate units is certainly families that are coming to the city with Section 8 vouchers may be able to move into a market rate unit.
That's true.
Because that Section 8 voucher will pay a small portion of the rent, and then they would pay the remainder out of the rent from their paychecks or whatever their household income is. So the idea of developing market rate units isn't to force a particular economic segment out.
Right.
It is to broaden it and take away some of the restrictions to open up the opportunities.
I wanna get to a point where, because you got a lot of, you got families that live in low-income housing, whatever the case might be, and then you get the first generation college kid. Then that kid graduates college, maybe has a girlfriend, combined income, maybe making a little over $100,000 a year. Now they want to move in together, right, or whatever the case. Like they're not income qualified for low-income housing.
Right.
South Holyoke, that census tract, remind me what the is it like 90% rental?
It is.
It's 90% rental, mostly.
Holyoke is actually upside down across the board. We're 60% rental and 40% home ownership. And we know that home ownership really supports communities and neighborhoods.
So for that kid, for that now couple that are doing well, right, aren't income qualified to get an apartment there, and if they do get an apartment, they have to pay market rate for a unit that's not probably that meeting this new standard that they are. And so there isn't really any real opportunity. And so if we can, if we mix it up and offer those opportunities, now we're offering people to actually stay in their neighborhood and not necessarily feel like they got to move out of the neighborhood. So when we're talking about gentrification, we're really trying to keep folks that grow up here to stay here.
And folks that are aging here as well, is to provide, the thought being that if we're providing opportunities for an aging population to maybe downscale, that will free up some of the single family homes, and then there'd be more opportunity for purchase and folks to stay, and then having some other rental units where folks that maybe are downsizing would be interested in moving into.
And just to be clear too, because I know sometimes it's not as easy as we're probably making it sound for anybody that might be watching this and cringing. Gentrification is a very delicate situation, and it's difficult. Like there's no one's really solved this problem, right? Like you improve neighborhood conditions, costs go up, rents go up, and we argue, well, folks that live in poor neighborhoods deserve quality things too and quality services. So it becomes a situation where you're chasing your tail. So I'm not sitting here saying that we have the ultimate solution, and I know it's not as easy as I make it sound, but in the grand scheme of it, like that's what's going on. And so as we go forward with this work, how do we continue to be sensitive to the fact that, we need to maintain our existing housing stock and make sure that they stay affordable.
And quality.
And quality.
We want healthy, that's one of the main goals. It's not just affordable, but also healthy, safe.
Which is another topic we can talk about as far as our enforcement measures and property owners.
We could have a whole separate conversation about
housing could be just its own.
Introduce opportunity for higher scale housing as people's lives improve. There's something there for them too, so that we're establishing a more vibrant neighborhood where people don't feel like they're being pushed out or priced out.
How does CDBG tie in with what we've been talking about?
So I think it ties in a couple of ways. One is certainly the financial investments that are made on an annual basis. But then the other piece too is there's a planning process to all of this. We don't just get to sit in our offices and decide, okay, we're going to do this. It's all part of a process. And so we're really excited today to start rolling out our next 5-year process for CDBG. So every 5 years, the city needs to submit a comprehensive plan to the federal government that says, here's a deep dive into the data of where we're at right now in Holyoke, whether it's the number of unsheltered folks on our streets, the number of folks that are looking for housing, the number of baby boomers, the exodus or entry of folks into the city. So we do quite a data collection. And then that 5-year plan lays the pathway for investments for the future. The important thing with this consolidated plan, and I know it's got a very technical name, but the important thing with the planning process is that regardless of whether I'm here in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, or whether the mayor is here in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, the next administration inherits that consolidated plan, and it's a tool for them to use in the process. So we're about to kick off our 5-year planning process. It's a public process. Over the summer, folks are going to see that we're going to be rolling out some community meetings. We want to hear from the folks at home about what their concerns are. We'll be doing a number of focus groups, that sort of thing.
And this will be for the city in general, not just the CDBG program. Is that correct?
So no, actually the consolidated plan is just for
CDBG?
just for
Oh, okay.
CDBG. But do you want to touch on the comprehensive plan that's going on as well?
Yep. So the last comprehensive plan is just the new way of saying master plan. We're moving away from saying master plan, calling comprehensive plans. The last plan was done in 1999, which was interesting because I remember being an active youth participant contributing to the development of that plan when some sort of this youth engagement event happened, focus groups that Alicia was alluding to. But obviously 20 plus.
I might have run one of those focus groups.
Yeah,
I wasn't going to say anything.
25 years later.
I was just a
time
baby
for
in
a new one.
'97.
So it was at the Congregational Church
Yep.
off of Maple Street there. It was at the Boys and Girls Club at the time. Obviously 20 plus years later, climate change wasn't a thing. Marijuana wasn't legal. There are many aspects to what's happening today that are very different. So what we want to do is revisit that. And all comprehensive master planning is, it's a glorified, it's a community engagement process, and that's really where the work is, because we want to make sure that at all levels that we're getting the voices of everybody in every corner of our city to shape the direction people want our city to go. And then it helps kind of set those priorities, like Alicia said, for the next 20 years. I might not be the mayor for the next 20 years, but when another administration comes, it's a document that they can refer to and say, okay, what are the community priorities? Oh, okay, here are the community priorities. So that when we're investing our resources and we're planning accordingly, or when we're revisiting areas that might need to be rezoned, or for whatever reason, because circumstances has changed. An area of the city might be different than where it was 20, 30 years ago, so we might have to revisit some limitations in the zoning, maybe some special permits that are reflected in the ordinances. Do we have to revisit those? So that it keeps the community focused, because you get what you plan for. That's the thing we kind of.
That's one of your motto. That's the
motto. You get what you
for.
plan for. Let's not shoot from the hip. Be strategic and focused. Resources are limited, and we want to make sure that as we continue to do the people's work, that the outcomes are aligning to what the community wants.
Alicia, let's just jump back to CDBG
Sure.
specifically for a little bit. You had talked about the 3 areas that you are providing funding in.
Yep.
And this year, I know you had many more applicants than you had available dollars. So what is the process when you have people applying for this grant, these federal monies? How do you decide who gets what?
Good question.
Good question. So I will do it in a nutshell, and then turn it to the mayor for more of the philosophical approach.
Yep.
So the practical, regulatory, bureaucratic approach is a public process, and we first solicit applications. Those applications are screened for eligibility. They are then listed on, I'm sure many folks have seen our allocation spreadsheet where they're broken out by category, so housing, infrastructure, public services. And then we have a number of folks who review those applications and make recommendations to the mayor. So we have a citizens advisory group where we have representatives of the community who sit around a table and review those, make recommendations to the mayor. We then take it to the DGR committee of the City Council, to the Development and Government Relations Committee. Same thing. They review all of the applications, they talk about the community needs, they review the prior 5-year consolidated plan. What did we say 5 years ago we were going to do? What are our needs? In some cases, they review the success of organizations or the status of organizations. How are they doing? Are they new? Are they well established? Have they been producing the results if they already have a grant with us? And then each one of those reviewers, the office staff, we review and make recommendations to the mayor based on what we're seeing as needs. And then the mayor takes all of those recommendations, starts to go through them, and then we also put out a draft document, and that draft document will be released in the next couple of days. It's an annual plan that says, here's how we're going to spend our money this year, and we welcome public comment. So the public also has an opportunity to weigh in. The mayor in May will then take all of those comments, recommendations, feedback. We get emails, we get letters, we get all kinds of things in. You know, if someone wants to call, someone wants to email, someone wants to write a letter, stop by the mayor's office, give some feedback, all of that is taken into account. He then sits at the table and makes the final allocations.
There are people who are familiar with this process, obviously, but I'm sure there are a lot of people who really don't have any idea where to even get this information.
That's right.
Can you give us a little bit more on how do you even find out about all these things? Maybe, Mayor, I'll hit you up with that one.
Yeah, you know, it's always one of the most difficult. I always tell folks all the time, like the most important thing of government is also the most difficult and challenging, and it's engagement. You know, how do you get the word out so that 100% of your stakeholders know about stuff that's going on, about decisions being made, and that they're getting an opportunity to, you know, share their thoughts or concerns, or, you know, some organization that might want to apply. So, you know, obviously you got the seasoned organizations that know the organization very well. They got the staff capacity and all the experts on hand to put in a very good competitive application. And you got smaller organizations that are doing good work. They just don't have the capacity like other organizations do and whatever. So Alicia's been around for a very long time, and so have I. Holyoke's not, you know, we like to be big and mighty, but, you know, it's a small community.
It is. There's lots of connections.
We know
There's lots of networks.
We know who's doing the work, and we know who needs a little more work. And when we do look at applications, we try to be mindful of those organizations that did apply, that might have not did, you know, the best submittal, but we know they're doing good work, so we're flexible. And then obviously there's always that, like, what if there's something new out there that's going on and they don't know anything and they didn't submit anything? So we try to keep our ear close to the ground. You know, when we are doing this process, I've set up a pretty good communication ground game of how I get stuff out. And so for those people that are thinking about applying, that might have never known or anything, if they are following me, they would know. And actually we've gotten new applicants that we've never seen before. You know, folks that are applying for CDBG and trying to understand the process. Once we see those, Alicia's reaching out, hey, you know, can we chat? Can we talk about what you submitted? I'd like to see how I can help you out. And some people don't even know whether or not what they're applying for is eligible, right? And maybe it isn't, but Alicia's like, I got this other thing over here that I want to talk to you about. So we try to be very vigilant on that, but obviously there's always going to be gaps, and I rely on the help of my networks to help me close those gaps.
Well, and you have been really good about putting out a newsletter, and I don't know if all the folks here in Holyoke know that the mayor puts out on a regular basis
Bi-weekly,
a newsletter in Spanish and English. So can you tell us how can people find that? Where do you post it?
Yeah, so I got to have an easier way of folks wanting, you know, to subscribe. Because right now, like, I'll share the newsletter on my social media feeds, and if you
that's
go
how
in,
I see it usually.
you can subscribe that way. But there isn't like a link on the website anywhere, which I needed to work on. But anyways, regardless of that, there are about 1,500 subscribers that get that, that get those newsletters when it goes out into the masses. And I have different social media feeds that I'm very active with, and I share them on that. And even after sharing the newsletter, I share bits and pieces of the newsletter separately, just to keep the information flowing, because I know people get it in different times of the week, the month, during the day, to get stuff out there. But you know, again, it's you know, I know I get a lot of feedback on how well we communicate information, and they've never seen that before, which is great. But I can tell you, I spoke with people who are completely disconnected and they don't know what's going on, how it's going on. So it's still, you know, there's still some gaps, and we just have to be mindful and vigilant on what those gaps are and making sure as an administration we're doing whatever we can to be sure that, you know, we're checking those boxes.
So if you're listening to this and you haven't seen the mayor's newsletters, you can probably call
Email me.
his office and find out how to
If you email
subscribe.
me at mayorsoffice@holyoke.org and say, hey, I want to subscribe to the newsletter. Some people do that. They'll email the mayor's office and I'll just go in and subscribe them.
Okay, so spread the word on that, folks.
And I think the other piece too, and particularly under Mayor Garcia, is that public engagement, public communication isn't a seasonal thing. You know, it's very seasonal in the CDBG world in that we set up public meetings and we have public hearings and there's this comment period, this 30 days where folks can comment on this particular document. But one of the philosophies that we've used in our office for a number of years now is that public engagement is a 365 activity. So if I'm in the grocery store and someone approaches me and says, you know, my grandmother, her roof is leaking. Well, I want to make sure right then and there, I want to link you up to the service that can help your grandmother's roof. If I'm on my personal time on the weekend looking at a social media feed and I see someone who's posting because they don't have food, I want to make sure that I respond to them and let them know, we have Kate's Kitchen, they have meals, there's a food pantry. Recently, there's been a number of those sorts of postings, so we've made sure on our social media feeds that we've put out where folks can get food. So in order to really be in government and properly do public engagement and communication and making sure you're getting the word out, it really is 365. We never go off.
I love that example because, like, really, and remember earlier in administration when we started, we kicked off a transition team where we had different groups.
Yes, the advisory groups.
The advisory groups, and we weren't sure where or what was going to come out of it, but you know, it's just another. What I have been trying to do, Linda, is build my connections and relationships and getting people actively involved, trying to get those tentacles out as much as possible, because when those folks are hanging out with their friends, sitting at the dinner table with their family, whatever, everyone's talking, right? There's all sorts of things, whether if it's something they saw on the news, quality of life issue, whether if it's like an experience they had driving through downtown or whatever, like, you know, if it's something that they're talking about, like, you know, a lot of families with children trying to figure out what youth activities or what's missing, or there's all sorts of opportunity for every resident to have at any level, a community engagement conversation and report that feedback. Because when they bring it back somehow, whether if it's participating in an advisory group, right? We have the trash recycling committee that Linda, and I knew you were actively involved, and that was perfect because your ear is very close to that ground, and that's information you can bring back as you live your normal life.
That's why I said I'm the one who's
Don't like
anti-styrofoam. Yes.
I got a police relations advisory team, right? Folks that are out there getting information just by living 365.
365.
Their normal life, they're
It's
bringing it back.
365.
Right? All these
It is.
different advisory groups and also municipal representation, you know, boards and commissions, you know, they're all out there constantly connecting in the community just by living their life normally, that they can always bring back to the table. The philosophical approach, and this is important because I lead through the lens of management, and I think that by now people understand that I really do not care about politics. Doesn't matter who's calling me, what level of status they might have in the community to influence a decision. What I look at is a couple of things when deciding on how to make these final allocations with CDBG. Obviously, what I like about Holyoke, and it's the first time I've seen this, the process that she just described, I don't know if other communities do that. You know, the chief executive authority is the decision maker of how these resources get allocated. That's why at the very end, the mayor makes the final allocation. It's really whatever the mayor says at the end, whatever the outcomes might be. But either way, it's a pretty neat engagement process because you get to see, it's like you're keeping your finger on the pulse. What does the community want? And so when you got the citizens advisory, you got the team at the community development office that's connected to all these social organizations, getting all the calls and the emails. They're making their recommendations based on what they're hearing. Then you got the city council, who broadly represent everybody citywide. The mayor can't be at every corner of our city, sitting at every kitchen table. So they got this broad understanding of, what the community needs are. So I look at like what's consistently supported across the board. If there's a consistent support for a particular project request, I'm going to support it, whether I like it or not. Like, it's like, okay, you know what? That's something that is shared across the board. Then there's those that are like, there is consistent support, but it varies, right? It's like,
$5,000 from one group, maybe $50,000 from another.
Another group is like, it varies, but it's still supported. Okay, well, what works there? There's some energy there. Let me see how I can support that. Then there's like results of plans. Like, we Alicia and I talk a lot about the mandated. So our local community hospital, the Holyoke Medical Center, every 3 years has this IRS mandate to do what they call community health needs assessment, SHNA for short, acronyms. And so it's a tool that they actually invest money in to produce a tangible document that reflects data on what the priorities are, which is difficult because when you live in a community like Holyoke, it's hard to say what is more priority over another because they're all important. But like when you look at that health data with limited resources, we say, all right, well, what are those top things? Like out of these issues that are going on, what is the most that's constant and that we can at least make somewhat of an impact? And so whatever the social determinant of health concern it might be that rises to the top, if there are submitted proposals to address a concern, like, that's being strategic, right? Strategic, focused, specific. And so I'll support that. And then lastly, and this is rare, but there are those project requests that are very important to me. And I don't do it all across the board. There might be one or two that might not get supported, like the sheltering, right? Like the pop-up warming shelter. I think 1 year, maybe 2 years in a row, it wasn't really supported across the board. But I know that it's a need, it's important, like it's like, or the Youth Commission.
And I think that speaks to that 365, is that the folks that may have said no to a pop-up warming shelter, they may not have had their thumb on the pulse of what was actually needed.
Right.
So that dialogue across the board is really...
The Youth Commission was another one, wasn't really, for many reasons. I'm not saying people don't support it, just wasn't funding supported of their process. And I know how important it is, like 365, like, I remember Youth Commission had an impact for me. I was a youth commissioner when it was available. Many people, our former mayor was a youth commissioner. There's a lot of leaders today who are adults that were former youth commissioners. And, this talk about not enough in our community for kids and things of that nature. And so those are the little things where I say, okay, these are important to me and I want to fund this regardless of what people say, and then we make it work.
As long as it's CDBG eligible.
As long as it's eligible. And, I do, like Alicia described, we get the emails and the calls, and then you start seeing who's emailing and who's calling, and, you're trying to get that influence. And the last thing, too, is like, we try to stretch the dollars. There's some organizations that won't close if they don't get that money, right? Like, if they don't get that $50,000.
$5,000. In a lot of cases.
If they don't get that $5,000, they're going to shut down and not be able to provide the service anyway, right? Like, okay, well, let's support that because that's important. We need to make sure it happens. And there are other organizations that are fine. They're well off. They got a diverse funding, revenue sources. The program's going to happen whether they get that money or not. So I won't fund that, right? Because I need to stretch these limited dollars as much as possible. If you can do it without it, then you don't need it. Great, you're doing the work anyways. I can't fund you.
Well, and you do have to stretch it, right? I don't know if you have the figures on what was asked for as opposed to what was available this year, but it was a huge difference, right?
So for instance, the public service category, we can allocate about $165,000 a year.
That's how limited it is.
That is very limited. I think this year's ask was over $485,000.
I remember because I was watching the meetings and
is
thinking there's such a huge need and you can't fund it all.
And you can't fund it all.
Here's the frustrating thing, Linda, and like when you don't fund a program, right, the narrative becomes the administration doesn't support that organization, doesn't support that program. And again, it doesn't bother me because I'm fine with making a hard decision and moving forward. Again, management. At the same time, it pulls on your heartstrings a little, makes you feel bad a little bit, right? You got to go home with that.
Well, sure, you'd love to be able to fund it
but
all,
the real question is, and we're celebrating all these years of CDBG funds, but to your point, and Alicia's point, it's extremely limited. There's so much need, and it's not fair that we got to get all these organizations fight for scraps. Mm-hmm. Now, it's been $2 million a year for the last, what did you say, 50 years?
It's been much less than 2 million. It's been about 1.1 million for the last, let's say, 15 years or so.
Right, and the cost.
It's actually gone down. The allocation has decreased.
So it's decreased,
but
and the costs are much higher today than what it was 20, 30 years ago. The needs are great, and so really, the conversation needs to be with our federal delegation and say, hey, inflation, need, what are we going to? Is it time to look at the CDBG program in its entirety and start making some adjustments there so that we can better keep up with these needs and not have organizations fight for scraps? So that's the challenge.
Right.
And certainly the federal delegation has been amazing in making sure that there's a continuation of the resources and that additional resources have come. But we're also in a different time and place. So we're leaving, hopefully, some of this pandemic behind us, but it has also left a 4-year history of trauma and incredible needs and business needs and housing needs. And so in looking at the future of the program, where are we going? What additional funds? And certainly after 50 years, I think it's an appropriate time to take a look at the impact of the program and whether or not that has perhaps increased needs. So when the mayor talks about the number of units in the city that have subsidized, that are subsidized and have low-income families, the effect of that over 50 years has been to drive up families in need. So families who may need food shares, families who may need daycare vouchers. And so perhaps it's time to relook at the formula allocation.
Does this program have to get renewed by the federal government on a regular basis?
It has to be renewed by Congress on an annual basis. Which when folks have seen on the news about the continuing resolutions, that's impacting us directly. So our funding comes from the federal budget that's set back in September. So back in September 2023, if the federal budget had been properly set then, those are the dollars that are going to arrive here on July 1st. When you see continuing resolutions, the issues of CDBG and other federal allocations to communities aren't settled. And so just within the last couple of weeks, Congress finally approved what's called the THUD bill and approved the funding. And so we're waiting to see what our allocation is. But we are at the mercy of the federal government. So if there's an administration that is not supportive of the CDBG and home programs, which we've seen, or Congress is not supportive of it, which we've seen when we had cuts a few years ago, these organizations and the city's reliance on the funds are at risk.
Well, and without getting political here, we're in a very critical election year. So I think it is important for people to know that a program like this does have to be renewed by our folks in Washington.
Every year. So, and I think the last piece that's just important to mention is, yes, it's the 50th anniversary of CDBG, but the history of Holyoke as a compassionate community and as a community that has offered housing for all and wanting to ensure the health and well-being of its residents, it goes back 100 years. As a city of opportunity and a city where folks who come and know that they have safe, stable housing.
That's right.
In fact, Lyman Terrace right here near City Hall is one of the first public housing complexes in the country. And it was developed when the Holyoke Housing Authority was put in place back in the 1930s, because there was a recognition that folks that were living and working in the mills in wards 1, 2, and 3 in in the flats didn't have proper housing, that they were living in wet, damp basements, and that they were in overcrowded conditions. And so this idea that Holyoke has a lot of subsidized housing or a lot of social service programming, it's not a new idea. It's not a political idea. This has been the history of the city for probably over 100 years now. And so it's a tradition that we want to continue, being a welcoming city, being a city of opportunity, being a city that can be proud of its housing stock, the services that it offers, and its compassion. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.
That is what it's all about. Are there any other things you'd like to highlight that you are really proud of over the 50 years that CDBG has been in operation?
So I'm happy to say I haven't been here for 50
No,
years.
I'm not
I
saying
was there
like,
38 of those years.
I'm sure you know
But
the
I
history.
think, I think if folks look across the city, they may not realize the projects and the activities in the city where funding from the Office for Community Development has touched. So let me just kind of give you a quick rundown. We manage both the CDBG program, which is why we're here today, but we also manage what's called the Home Investment Partnership Program.
Sure.
They're like CDBG funds, but they can only be used for housing. So some of our investments, certainly Community Fields has been a great resource. We have one of the few outdoor skating rinks. We'll set climate change aside for a second. In the area. Holyoke invested in the only waterfront access point for the entire city at Jones Ferry River Access Center. So CDBG was used to create the only waterfront access. That's Jones Ferry Marina. It was Jones Ferry Marina, now Jones Ferry River Access Center. The skateboard park, Carlos Vega Park with its spray pools.
All the spray pools.
Almost all the spray pools, yeah. I mean, Holyoke is fortunate that if you map it, a resident of Holyoke has the opportunity to walk to a park or recreational space within a half mile, a quarter mile.
We have a lot
We
of
have a
parks.
ton of parks, and most of those have been improved with CDBG funds. In terms of housing, folks are familiar with the former Holyoke Catholic. That was one of our projects, conversion from Holyoke Catholic and the convent and the rectory to housing development. Some of the Greater Springfield Habitat for Humanity homes that people have been seeing on the news recently, they've been funded by our programs. We offer first-time homebuyer assistance.
Library Commons.
Library Commons in downtown.
South Holyoke Homes.
Downtown Holyoke.
The Alpaca Mill.
Alpaca Mill recently got
There's a lot.
some CDBG funds. We're about to make an investment in Library Commons 2. There's a number of single-family homes that we've built or developed with CDBG funds. Most of the area at the foot of Lyman Street, in and around One Holyoke, was developed back in the 70s with CDBG funds. That neighborhood does have a very high level of home ownership.
And there are a lot of, a lot of homeowners too that are income qualified that might not be able to get a roof.
Yep.
Fixed.
So over the last 5 years, we've rehabbed 176 homes.
Wow.
That's the rehab. So, I mean, and then it moves from things that folks think of like in their home base to businesses. So for instance, Gateway City Arts received a grant for new windows back when they were doing rehab of the building. We offered, I think, we supported 23 small businesses with CDBG funds over the last 5 years, whether that was helping them with their rent or their insurance or training for the business owner. So it really, CDBG funds, because of the creativity and the flexibility, it crosses all segments.
It's also allowed us to do a great deal of sidewalk repairs too, in and around the downtown area. We're looking forward to do more to make sure that that they're walkable and safe and accessible. I know we have a lot more accessibility issues we need to address, and I think we can talk about that.
We're doing some stuff with pedestrian safety, and certainly our municipal amenities. So not just parks, but our senior center has been supported with CDBG, our public library.
I think people will really be happy to hear all of these different projects. We're just about ready to wrap up. I know it's been a great conversation, but one of the things I think we haven't really talked about is what makes a neighborhood or a street eligible for CDBG funding.
You want me to take that one?
Yep.
So eligibility for CDBG is based on the household income of the residents that live there. It's done by census tract. So when we look at the census mapping and determine that a street, that 51% of the occupants on that particular side of the street are low and moderate income, that's what makes the neighborhood eligible.
So when we say low and moderate income, we're using these numbers. Standards that you gave us
We're using
before.
those standards, and then we're using data from the census and data that HUD puts out. Interestingly, since my time with the Office for Community Development, which has been since about 2011, the neighborhoods the geographic spread of the CDBG eligible neighborhoods has increased. So where we were one time concentrated to just downtown because of the changing income limits, we're now able to go up towards Pleasant Street and then sort of towards Brown Avenue, up towards Northampton Street. Really the only places that we're not able to make CDBG investments pretty much wholesale are Smiths Ferry in the northern part of the city, West Holyoke, along Homestead Avenue, that sort of thing. However, those are neighborhood-based amenities. If you have a low-income, let's say a low-income elderly homeowner in West Holyoke that needs a septic system,
Right.
we are able to make investments.
Oh.
A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah.
That's actually really good and important for anybody that's watching at home that lives in West Holyoke. If you're in, call Alicia, we'll look into it, and if you're
Yep.
income eligible, because there's septic systems
Yep.
out there,
Right.
and a lot of folks don't know that, like, there's a potential that you'll qualify to get a replacement if
Yes.
that way it doesn't really hit your bottom line, because I know costs are going up
Yes.
everywhere, and as a homeowner, right, you're dealing with increases in insurance. How many times I hear about the taxes.
And if we don't have the resources, we do have a community resource guide, and we're also really tied into the network of what's going on locally in the Pioneer Valley and across the state. So for instance, septic system, if we don't have the money readily available for you right now, we know that there's a state program that can assist.
So that's why a project like the Glautech Woods over in West Holyoke, that was, I assume, not eligible for CDBG
Correct.
funding, but we were able to use some community preservation
Community
money
Preservation
or
Act.
other
Yep.
funds to help
Exactly.
develop that.
Exactly. And then there's opportunities where we try to be creative in the approach. So again, if an activity is going on and it's not in a low and moderate income neighborhood, but it might address a spot blight. For instance, if you have a vacant and abandoned building, we may be able to help. So we try to really be as flexible, and like I said, not only just screening in as opposed to screening out, but also screening in entire neighborhoods.
So the bottom line is really call and find out, right?
Call the mayor's office. They can direct you over, send you over.
Okay. Well, this has been a great, it's been a lot of information, and I really want to thank both of you. Is there anything else that you wanted to add about this program before we close?
I should be making my final allocation soon.
In the next few weeks.
In the next few weeks, and hopefully we can kick off the next 5 years, the comprehensive planning phase for the next 5 years of how we invest community development block grants. So definitely watch out for that. We want the community to put in their word and what they want to see and what are issues or priorities that they like to see these funds invested in. And also watch out for the comprehensive master planning process too, because this is going to be an opportunity to really help shape the trajectory of where we want to take our city. Obviously, there are a lot of layers to government. It's not a top-down institution. It's a very bottom-up organization. And so it's going to be important that as I work together with our city council to try to make those changes where we need to, or even when we're during budget season, we're trying to fund those departments that are doing the important quality of life work. As we go forward with investing limited resources, no matter where they come from, in partnership with other stakeholders like our city council, working with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that feedback we get in that comprehensive planning process is critical, so that we can hit our targets as we go forward in the work of improving quality of life for residents in Holyoke.
Well, thank you both for taking the time to meet with us today. And thank you to Holyoke Media for providing this forum and an opportunity for folks in our city to learn more about what's going on.
Thank you.